Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session on investigating pollution from the AltEn ethanol plant in Mead, Nebraska, a live Q&A with researchers. I'm Dr. Jesse Bell, Director of the Water, Climate, and Health at the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute and the Claire M. Hubbard Professor of Water, Climate, and Health in the Department of Environmental, Agricultural, and Occupational Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. In early 2000s, the previous owner of the AltEn plant near Mead, Nebraska, planned a unique ethanol production process that integrated cattle into the operation. The original concept behind the facility was a closed loop system that fed leftover distiller grain to cattle in a nearby feedlot as a nutritional supplement. However, the company entered bankruptcy shortly after opening of ethanol per year using agricultural seed that were pre-treated with pesticides to assist with fertilization and growth. At one time, AltEn said that it received 98% of the excess treated seed in the country. However, the ethanol production process, when applied to treated seeds, creates waste that is laced with chemicals that researchers say may be harmful to humans, animals, and the environment. The two primary concerns are toxic distiller grain, and also known as wet cake, and wastewater lagoons that are located on site at the AltEn site. The AltEn site has 3 lagoons. They're holding 176 million gallons of wastewater. In 2019, the state tested both of these byproducts, the wet cake and the lagoons, at the AltEn facility, and found that levels of pesticide were thousands of times greater than EPA recommended levels, meaning they could no longer be applied for land use. The wet cake and wastewater can no longer be applied for agricultural land use. The piles of distiller grain, around 84,000 tons, are now stacked in large mounds on site at the AltEn facility. The University of Nebraska has formed a team to conduct a multiple year study on the human health and environmental impacts. By environmental impacts, we're including plants, water, soil, and air around the AltEn ethanol facility. Some researchers from that team are joining us today. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Judy Wu-Smart, who brought attention to this particular issue, was one of the first to bring attention to this particular issue. Dr. Wu-Smart is an extension and research epidemiologist or entomologist at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, who first began noticing bee colonies dying off in 2017 on land south of the AltEn facility. Dr. Wu-Smart, can you tell us a little bit about your research and how it pertains to the ethanol, AltEn ethanol facility?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Jesse. And I wanted to just really quickly thank DWFI for hosting. Regarding the bee losses, we had really no idea what was going on at the ethanol plant and weren't aware, but while we were searching for causes for our bee losses, we became aware of these high pesticide loads in the nearby plants and in bee collected pollen. So bees can typically forage anywhere from 1 to 4 miles away from their hive. And during that foraging activity, their fuzzy little bodies pick up all these little toxins in the air. So they're considered really great bioindicators of our environmental quality. And we were seeing these losses of beehives across 6 different apiaries, roughly 3 miles apart from one another. So we knew that there was a widespread exposure and that systemic pesticides were involved, but it was really difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly where, how, and at what levels these bees were becoming exposed. So these systemic pesticides include these neonicotinoid insecticides and several different types of fungicides that are commonly used in agricultural crop production systems. And they're even used as seed coat treatments to protect seedlings from root dwelling and stem feeding insects and pathogens. But the residues can be translocated to the leaves and the nectar and the pollen, where a lot of these beneficial pollinators become exposed. So when we became aware of this AltEn situation, what the bee losses were telling us was that these systemic pesticides and the pollution was likely moving off-site. What we don't know is whether or not these contaminants were really predominantly coming from runoff into the water systems or through the soil, applications of the solid waste cakes, but how much the plants and the crops are taking up of these residues is a main or real concern for us still. So that's an area of research that we will continue to work on to try to find exactly how the bees are becoming exposed and which plant systems are being impacted. And then I just want to finally just kind of say that, I know a lot of people or some people may not think the loss of some insects is really a bad thing, but just consider that this persistent and chronic exposure to chemicals might lead to pest insect populations and diseases to persist and become more resilient to chemical interventions. So that will require over time more or stronger chemical applications to control those populations, putting communities potentially at higher risk. The other thing I wanted to mention really quickly is that these beneficial insects are really highly sensitive organisms. So other systems may not be impacted in the same way, but if we lose these beneficial insects, we also potentially lose the ecological services that they provide and potentially the food web support. They provide a lot of food for a lot of other critters, which I'm going to pass it back to Jesse so that our other colleagues kind of talk about those larger ecological ramifications.
Thank you, Judy. I really appreciate that. I'd like to introduce the rest of our research team joining me today. Dr. Ali Khan is the Dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Dr. Eleanor Rogan is a professor and chair of the Department of Environmental, Agricultural, and Occupational Health at UNMC. Dr. Dan Snow is the director of the Water Sciences Laboratory at UNL. Dr. Liz VanWormer is assistant professor and One Health coordinator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Throughout the session today, if you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A box on the top right of your screen. We will try to address as many questions from the audience as possible during our hour, but this will go fast. So I have some questions just to start us off, and I'm going to go through each of our researchers here, and I'm going to start with Dr. Rogan. And Dr. Rogan, can you tell us a little background on this project and why all these researchers came together and what you hope to gain from this project or from this evaluation?
I'm glad to try to share this with you today. When it became publicized and we became aware that there was this potential environmentally dangerous situation at the AltEn plant, and we were concerned about the environmental health and the health of human beings living in the area, living and working in the area. And these are certainly public health considerations. These are the kinds of things that public health tries to prevent harm coming to people from toxins like this. So we decided that we needed to conduct a broad investigation into what kind of health effects are actually happening. We know that people at Mead and also who live near the where the wet cake was spread on fields, we know those people are complaining of health effects, and so that's one thing we wanted to find out is what kinds of health effects are they complaining about, and thinking might have come from exposure to these toxins. And then another aspect is the environment, and what are we doing to the environment? Is, for example, the water getting contaminated? And we in fact know through our research and that of others that the water from AltEn plant generally runs to the southeast. It is running through some creeks and reservoirs, and there's some damage, environmental damage there already. And there's a concern that it can reach the Platte River. So we need to explore this through sampling surface water and groundwater. We certainly don't want these compounds permeating through the groundwater and where there will be a long-term contamination problem. And we also need to look at the long-term health implications of this because many of the things that these compounds might do to human health, they aren't going to happen tomorrow. We're particularly concerned about infants and small children because the neonicotinoids are neurotoxins, and we want to see whether there's any problems with exposures for these children. We think that these compounds would be exposed through, you'd have exposure either through the water or possibly through air, dust from the mounds of wet cake that are stored on the site. So that's kind of an overview of what we're hoping to get out of this through looking at human health and then also environmental factors.
Thank you. And as were the, just out of curiosity, can you give us an idea where the research stands now and a brief timeline of the project?
Well, one member of our group has been sampling surface water in a couple of streams and a reservoir around the AltEn plant, and she's been doing monthly samples, and they have the data from actually the first set, which was in April, and they're now working through data from more recent months from samples taken that were then analyzed by Dan Snow and his co-workers at the Water Science Lab at UNL. So we are beginning to gather those data showing how these compounds are traveling through creeks and streams. She's also going to be sampling the groundwater and soil to see if there's contamination there. So that's the kind of information we have. Dr. Wu-Smart and Dr. VanWormer are looking at insects and small animals, and I can let them tell you what they're finding there. And so we've begun to survey the health concerns of people in this town of Mead and the surrounding countryside. That study has gotten underway. And lastly, we hope in the new year to actually have set up and begun enrolling people in a medical registry that we anticipate will go on for a decade or so to see whether long-term health effects occur in people, anyone who's living in that area.
Thank you, Dr. Rogan. And so next I'm going to move on to Dr. Liz VanWormer. Liz, I was kind of curious, what is some of the, why is it important to consider pesticide impacts on domestic animals and wildlife near Mead? And what is it that you're potentially looking at?
Sure, thanks, Jesse, and thanks to DWFI. I just want to say that I did lose internet access at my office a few minutes ago, so I'm hoping that I stay here the whole time. If I disappear, please come back to me later and let me know if I've double covered anything that Dr. Rogan was talking about as well. So animals are a really interesting point to consider, I think, in this whole perspective. We know that the process of treating these seeds and runoff of wastewater from processing and the land application of the products that resulted from it have the potential to impact the health of people, domestic animals like our pets and livestock, wildlife, as well as the ecosystems that we're sharing. So for example, on the wildlife side, we know that significant population declines of certain songbirds in the United States and Europe have been linked to neonicotinoid pesticides in the environment. And these pesticides have the potential to kill some birds directly if the seeds are ingested, if the birds happen to eat the pesticide-coated seeds. But we can also see long-term impacts on animal populations due to exposure to non-lethal levels. So if they're ingesting lower levels or exposed to lower levels of the pesticide in their habitat. We're also concerned, like Dr. Wu-Smart mentioned, about the broader impacts of effects of pesticides on prey, or I'm sorry, on insect species, which are prey to many of these animals. So if the insect populations drop and we lose ecosystem services associated with them, or we disrupt some of those prey webs in the environment, that could indirectly impact amphibians and birds and small mammals as well. And we know that cattle and dogs and other animals are sharing this landscape too. And so I think there's a lot of value in integrating animal sampling into a broader approach to make those connections between our people, our pets and livestock, and the wildlife and the environments that we share. And we are looking for direct impacts of the pesticides, whether that might be animals dying or animals becoming ill. But we're also looking at animals to help us understand pesticides in the landscape, because they can serve as really important sentinels of environmental exposure. So animals play a lot of different roles in our lives and in this project. And we're working with a broad group to try to integrate them. There have been a lot of studies on pesticide impacts on different organisms in the past, whether we're thinking about amphibians or birds. And a lot of times these are done with a single pesticide in a really controlled laboratory environment, maybe a small scale field setting. But we have a lot to learn about the impacts of mixtures of pesticides in natural environments. And because this is such a big problem and such an open topic, we're really drawing from multiple disciplines. So experts on bird populations, experts on frog populations, as well as pesticide experts, to try to understand what's going on with animals in this landscape. So I'll stop there and we can always follow up. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. And now I'm going to move on to Dr. Dan Snow. Dan, given your expertise in water, and can you just give us some perspective on the contaminant levels that we're seeing around the AltEn facility on site and also within the village of Mead? Are there other areas in the state that experience these levels, and really just how bad is the situation there? Or what does the situation look like there?
Sure. I guess in some ways we were fortunate that the incident occurred in eastern Nebraska, because Judy and her students were already monitoring for these pesticides, and it was because of some of that monitoring that she was doing they actually became aware of the exposures, the unintended consequences of the way the wet cake and the wastewater was being handled. So I think we were pretty prepared in that respect. At the Water Sciences Laboratory, we had supported other projects looking at the fate and transport of neonicotinoid insecticides in several watersheds throughout eastern Nebraska. So we have a pretty good idea of what levels to expect in surface water, just from treated seed application. So the normal application of these seeds on cropland and what levels we would expect from that. So in comparison to what we find just from traditional use, I'd say these concentrations are probably 10 to 100 times higher than what we would expect in normal non-point source runoff from fields that are planted with treated seed. In addition to those monitoring studies, we're also working with another faculty member that's looking at degradation pathways for these compounds, and just happen to be ready to measure some of these degradation products, some of which can be particularly toxic in comparison to the parent compounds. So we were ready to test and analyze samples, not just for the parent compounds, but for these degradation products. And from the data that we've generated so far, we see pretty high levels of some of these degradation products, some of which can be several hundred times more toxic than the parent compound. So I think we're ready to do this monitoring and ready to figure out where these compounds are going through all of the sampling that Judy and Liz and Shannon Bartelt-Hunt and her students are doing. So I feel like we're prepared for this.
Nice. Thank you, Dan. And then last, Dean Kahn, I was going to ask you, there's already residents in the village of Mead that are worried about respiratory issues and other health issues. From a human health perspective, what are some of your main concerns for the community of Mead?
Thank you, Dr. Bell, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about some of the human toxicity from these neonics. So let me start by reminding people that these chemicals and the metabolites are easily found in biological samples. So there's no doubt that they're taken up by humans. And so I think of it in three different categories. So I think of it in sort of what is the short-term impact of these chemicals, and this is well known from individuals, for example, who spray pesticides. So respiratory illness is well described in those individuals, and it's not surprising that that's what we're hearing from people who've been exposed in Mead. In addition to that, what's reported in these individuals are neurologic impacts, so sort of memory loss, finger tremor, headaches, and other signs are commonly seen. So that's what we would look for in the short term. Now, long-term, based on animal studies, we are aware of at least 4 different categories of toxicity that we would be worried about. So one is toxicity on fertility. The other is toxicity on the liver, so liver toxicity, brain toxicity, and the final is gene toxicity. So we do know that this sort of, for use of a better term, scrambles your DNA. So these 4 known toxicities are known in animal studies. So those would be the sort of long-term things and medium-term things we'd like to look at with this over the next 5 to 10 years, as Dr. Rogan has just laid out. So that's 1, 2, and the third is the exposure on pregnant women. And to be very honest with you, that's the one that gives me some of the greatest pause, because this is potentially, lifelong impact for many women who are who have had children or having children in Mead, Nebraska. Now, the data is much better in animal studies, but what we do know in human studies, so if you look at women who, based on how close they live to places where these neonics are being used, what you find is that their babies are more likely to have deformed brains and deformed hearts. And so there's one study that's been published along those lines. And then there's another study that looked at children of moms who used one of these neonics is very commonly used as flea and tick treatment in the home. And so they looked at moms that used this treatment, and what they found was that there was a slight increased risk of autism in those kids compared to moms who did not. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not blaming autism on these neonics. I just want to say that there's a lot of unknowns out there. And I hope I sort of express this as lots of unknowns. So we're trying to, given how much of these chemicals are used across millions of acres in the US, this is an opportunity, unfortunately, an unfortunate opportunity, but to really understand these so we can protect the health of the people in Mead and their babies, and think about what does that mean for the health of other Americans who are exposed to these chemicals. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean Kahn. That's a good perspective. And both you and Dr. Rogan talked about that this isn't just now, this is obviously a long-term thing as well. And so what are some of the potential long-term plans that are being developed and should be developed around the situation that's at Mead?
Well, I'm very hopeful that the state and other organizations, research organizations, philanthropic organizations will provide funding to support these studies for this community and their health, and that we'll be able to establish a registry where we will routinely collect samples from individuals, monitor their health, and let them know what's, periodically also, give data back to them, tell them what's going on, what they should be looking for, and do this over a long period of time, and not just ignore these individuals in a year from now or 2 when this goes out of the news, because the chemical will not leave their body in a year or 2, right? And the exposure in their community is not going to be gone in a year or 2, even though it may not be newsworthy. So we really do need that commitment today to make sure that we establish these long-term registries and get them up and running.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kahn. And we have some questions in the chat. Dan, I think the first one is for you. One of the wells recently tested that showed some amount of pesticide contamination was outside the range expected to be caused by the AltEn spills. How concerned do Nebraskans need to be about the widespread contamination of groundwater?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think as somebody mentioned earlier, these compounds are very water soluble. and they're fairly persistent in soil. So that translates into being pretty leachable, which means they're going to, a small amount will be moved below the root zone and eventually reach the water table. Now, from traditional uses, we shouldn't see any measurable levels in groundwater. Now, there are some studies, say in Wisconsin, that are showing signs that these compounds are reaching the water table and getting into groundwater. We've just started a program where we're analyzing neonicotinoid insecticides in Nebraska groundwater. So we'll find out a little bit more about that and hopefully be able to answer that question in the coming months.
Thank you, Dr. Snow. Then there's another question that was in the chat. This is probably to either Dr. Rogan or Dr. Khan. To what extent has the research team been in communication with Region 7 EPA officials?
We haven't had any communication with the Region 7 EPA officials because a state entity needs to make contact with EPA, and we're not authorized to make that kind of contact. That would be my response.
I guess I'll add to that. I haven't directly contacted Region 7, but I have contacted the Office of Research in EPA, and they are preparing to do some on-site monitoring through their research division. This is not the regulatory side. This is the research side, specifically devoted to air exposure of humans in the AltEn area. So EPA is aware of the problem, and they're bringing their research team to bear on this particular problem.
Dr. Smart, did you have some interactions also with EPA?
Yes, I was just going to add, I have contacted directly with both regional EPA, Region 7 EPA, and the national division, but that was really focused on the pollinator health side and the concerns related to toxins being expressed in that vegetation. But they are aware of the situation.
And I guess just as a little bit of a follow on, what entities have also been contacted around this situation or are engaged in some way around this situation? With that, I was thinking NDE and USGS, or yeah, USGS.
I can speak a little bit to that. And the Nebraska Department of Ag has been involved previously. The Department of Energy and Environment have been involved. Many of the state organizations are aware and have either contacted or have stayed interested, including Game and Parks, Wildlife Federation, many of the conservation groups, organizations. We have many of these conservation groups and community leaders that are working together to keep this in the social media and public awareness arena. So there's a lot of people both locally and kind of nationally involved in this. NRDC, User Sea Society, it goes on and on.
I'd like to add too, the Department of Environment and Energy provided us with a lot of information that's helping us to map out the locations and the amounts of wastewater, locations receiving wastewater and wet cake. So we're using all of that data to strategize on the best places to collect samples.
And on the research side, we also have USGS partners, USDA partners, and Creighton University partners, and many others that are interested in getting involved.
Thank you so much. And then there was another question that was in the chat. This one I think is a little bit open to everyone. How much access to the actual AltEn and feedlot site do you currently have for sampling and testing?
Well, we're in contact with the cattle operation that was jointly owned and now has been sold to someone else. It's just south of the AltEn facility and shares some I don't know, materials with them. And we are here at the university in the process of putting together a detailed plan for what we would like to do to go and sample on their property. I hope, I imagine this will happen sometime in November. They are ready for us to come, and they just want to plan so they know what we're going to do when we come, what kinds of samples we want to take and what we'll be measuring.
And we've had zero access to the AltEn site itself.
No.
Complete radio silence.
And we have another question that came into the chat. Or I guess a couple more questions actually that came into the chat. If this team had not started probing into the situation, what would have happened? Is this something that state agencies would have taken on, or how would we know the extent of the contamination? I think that's kind of a difficult one to address in any capacity at this point.
Well, I think I'll take a stab at it. So I've been preparing for some presentations for this particular topic. I've gone through the records that NDE has accumulated for this particular site. And it's clear from those records that they weren't happy with the way that the waste was being handled. So eventually, over time, I'm sure some action would have been taken. Now, the fact that they had a spill, a very serious spill of wastewater, certainly accelerated that process. But they were ready to take action regardless of what we had been doing on the adjacent property. Judy, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's all scale. Yeah, from when the acknowledgement of concerns was to when we actually saw some action. I feel like there was some lag time there that could have been cut down, but
Years.
yeah.
Thank you. And then another question in the chat, are the seed companies who sent the treated seed to AltEn supporting these research efforts in any capacity?
So,
No. Go ahead.
So Emily, that's a great question. The answer is no, they're not supporting this research. Actually, the only support that we've had for this research, and it spans not just the University of Nebraska, our University of Creighton colleagues are also part of that effort. The only support we've had is from a very generous philanthropist in town, the Hubbard Foundation. And unless we get additional support for this effort, there will be no long-term health studies.
I would just add on the research support side, I completely agree with Dean Kahn. We did have the chance to get some support from UNL this summer to integrate undergraduate students into wildlife and insect sampling. And so that was, a nice way to merge our teaching and research efforts so we could have some experiential learning in the field and start to understand some of these really complex ecosystem dynamics. But I think that grant writing is a big part of what we're all thinking about. And I think everybody on the team would probably agree that it's incredibly hard to plan a long-term study without secure funding. And so I think we're all very focused on trying to understand where to have that support.
Yeah, and that philanthropic support that came at the beginning is really just intended to be seed funding to get things started. So we're all making as much effort as we can to try to raise more money so that we can continue us beyond the current 12 months.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of in-kind and voluntary support from all the researchers that are included in this, which is definitely appreciated. And so one of the other questions that came in from Barbara was, what happened with the cattle that were on the feedlot?
The cattle that are on the feedlot continue to be prepared for market and sent for market. There isn't, if you're talking about the feedlot that's just, that was part of the same company that's just south of this of the plant. There, we don't have, because in part because, well, nobody's really looked. There is no evidence that the feedlot cattle have been exposed to anything harmful. And until we look, we wouldn't see anything. So up till now, there was some sampling there done. I don't know the details by NDEE, and they did not find significant levels of the compounds in whatever they sampled. But that's a question. I mean, we really don't know whether the cattle have been, in the time that they're there on the feedlot, whether they have been affected or not. And it's a question we'd like to answer if we can.
And the next question that came up is in a direct response from one of the previous questions. Who controls the AltEn site right now, and who is giving you radio silence? And that's from Emily.
I think that's a Dean Kahn question.
It can be a Dean Kahn question. The owners of AltEn control the AltEn site, and the manager there and the ownership are the ones who have not responded to a request to allow us to come and visit with them, learn more about what's going on, and take samples.
And then the USGS, so there's another question in the chat. USGS has done some recent neonic sampling of groundwater and the Platte River related to this. Dr. Snow mentioned that there's been lots of stream neonic sampling. Can you point us to those data, David?
Yes, I can share the publications that came about because of that study.
Thanks, Dan. And so one of the questions that I was going to throw out to the team was, what are some of the factors that led to this particular situation, allowed it to potentially occur? And could this potentially happen again? Or do you think that a situation like this could potentially happen again elsewhere?
I don't think so. I think this has gotten so much publicity that there's no way that anybody's going to let this happen to this scale.
I think that there's the sort of the loophole here that enabled this to happen was that the fact that the seed corn was coated with these neonicotinoids and fungicides made them unregulated. And so, and that's kind of a loophole that this went through. Otherwise, it would have been a prohibited activity. I think that, and there certainly wasn't any oversight in Nebraska that required anybody to determine whether the concentrations of these compounds would be what they would be like in the materials that are produced in the process. So I certainly think if Nebraska had certain kinds of stronger environmental laws, that would have prohibited this.
I sort of disagree with that. I
Okay.
think Nebraska has a good handle on environmental issues. Really, the problem with registration and regulation of these seed treatments is at the federal level. And it's not that EPA has not tried to regulate treated seed. They haven't been allowed because of our political system. They were sued to start to regulate treated seed products over 10 years ago. And our government didn't allow them to start doing that. So it really needs to happen at a higher level than the state if we're going to get control and be able to monitor use of these compounds.
Fair enough.
And I would expand a little bit as well and throw in that this situation, I agree, Dan, that this situation is likely to not occur again, because this was a unique situation and it definitely brought up a lot of bad press for a lot of individuals. But I would say that situations like this could happen again elsewhere, not necessarily surrounding neonics, or maybe neonics. We'll see what the potential future holds, but situations like this, especially in rural communities, there's less sometimes collective voice around some of these types of issues. And there's also some of these problems seem to kind of fall into the rural communities. And there's a number of reasons why rural communities can be more susceptible to these types of situations. That doesn't necessarily mean that was the situation that happened at Mead, but sometimes in rural communities, they can be, if there's a facility that's potentially polluting in the area, that could be a large producer or a large employer within the community. And it can be difficult for rural communities to actually have a voice to push back against a situation that might cause large unemployment within the community. So rural communities are definitely susceptible in a lot of ways when these types of situations happen. And hopefully this shows that. Oh, go ahead, Judy, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I totally agree. And I think that it's unlikely that the scale of a pollution issue would happen again, but there is still a risk of this kind of stuff happening until we can really sort out how we should properly dispose of these products, these treated seeds in large quantities, because corn and soy and crop production systems aren't going to slow down. They're going to continue to utilize these products, but AltEn is no longer receiving these outdated surplus treated seeds. So where are we going to dispose of these products? And as production continues, I think that end needs to be sorted to really prevent this from happening again.
Well, I guess I could think of a way that AltEn maybe could have done this different, which would not have resulted in the contamination. They could have washed the treated seed and then treated that wash water prior to discharging it on the cropland. That would have been a very simple solution if they had been required to do that from the very beginning. So technology can provide the solution if our laws and regulations require that sort of action to happen at the beginning.
And Dan, as a follow-up, Emily had a question for you about, can you share the Wisconsin study showing neonics reaching the groundwater levels from routine agricultural use? Sure.
And I think Michelle Hedlick from the USGS has done a lot of work on this across the US. So because these are very water soluble compounds and because the use is probably increased by a factor of 10 or more, there's a much higher risk that they're going to show up in places where we least expect. So this is on a lot of people's radar right now.
Thank you. And we have a bunch more questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to get through some of these. Overall, what is the end goal with the investigation into the Mead plant or into the plant in Mead? What will happen with the waste? So there's kind of two different questions there. One is more around what is the end goal with the investigation, which honestly is to understand the environmental potential impacts and the human health impacts and to the facility or to the area, and then what will happen with the waste.
I think what will happen with the waste is outside our purview. We're not charged with, we're not trying to clean this up. That's not our area of expertise.
But it will be cleaned up, I guess. They're not allowed to discharge it the way they were. So it'll be disposed of probably by some sort of a treatment process and maybe incineration. It is still legal to dispose by landfill. Right now, there's no nearby landfills that will accept the product. And I guess I'll go first on the first part of that question. You know, my goal from the beginning was to do a more or less complete environmental site assessment. So we know how to do that from the Superfund program. We just want to get an idea through sampling and modeling and more measurements, the extent of the contamination and what was exposed. You know, so what are the impacts from exposure? And if we can do that in as short a period of time as possible, I think we will achieve that goal.
I want to add to that on the longer period as possible, which is how do we protect the health of this community? Right. So that was a key goal, I know, for the college when they got engaged in this effort.
I think maybe another side goal that goes with those two is really bring together people from diverse perspectives and backgrounds, whether they're at the university or partner organizations or the communities, so that we can, harness the power of everybody's collective understanding to really look at these broader impacts. It's raised a lot of questions. And so that interdisciplinary and different stakeholder work, I think, is a really important part of it too.
And hopefully this shows that the university is a resource for the state and for our communities to help address some of these challenging problems as well. And so, Dan, you talked about the Superfund site, and there's a question in here about that. The former Army ammunition plant located adjacent to the site is a Superfund site and has been there for decades. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. EPA have immense amount of data from water quality sampling and analysis that may be useful. Do you have a good handle on the background unit concentration in groundwater and surface water? And that's from Virginia.
Okay, so for the first question, yeah, I was aware of the site assessment and then subsequent cleanup that was done at the Nebraska ordnance plant facility, and actually worked with some of the researchers that were testing new remediation techniques. And I agree, we have a lot of good data that can be used from those studies. And then the second question, from the literature and from the measurements that we've done here at the Water Sciences Laboratory, the background concentrations rarely exceed 1 part per billion. Often they only get in the range of, say, 20 parts per trillion from a routine use in surface water. In groundwater, we're not likely to find detectable concentrations, say, above 20 parts per trillion. Now, there may be cases where it will get, say, as high as 1/10 of a part per billion, but most often we won't find the active ingredient at concentration, say, above 1/10 of a part per billion.
And we have 2 other questions. We've kind of addressed these questions, but I just want to make sure that I throw them out here. What is being done with the leftover treated seed corn now? Which seems like that's kind of up in the air and we don't really know for sure. And does anyone know where the seed companies have pivoted to sending their discarded treated seed this year? And so it's kind of in the same vein. So
I'll answer the first question. They're just covering it to keep more material from getting off the property. So it's being covered until they can figure out how they're going to dispose of it. I don't know the answer to the other question.
I kind of know a little bit of an answer for the question. I know that the seed companies and a lot of the agricultural groups involved with the Pesticide Stewardship Alliance has created a special task force to address this specific hazardous waste question related to treated seed disposal. And they're trying to refine some of the recommendations for options for where people can dispose of these treated seed products through either incineration, like Dan had mentioned, or through some other treatment source. And I'm still trying to sort through all the information that they're trying to update, but that's one response, is that they're looking and reviewing state by state, what are these options and what can people, suppliers, utilize as disposal facilities. I think there's still, some unknowns there.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Dan. And then there was another question that was from Kenneth in the chat. Are you seeking funds from the state to pay for the short and long-term research and analysis that needs to be done?
I think somebody is.
Yeah.
So we've applied to the Nebraska Environmental Trust for funds to support this study. And the many members of the legislature are aware of the need to support this study, and they may well choose to help support this study in the future. There's no place to apply for funds to the state besides the one I just gave you.
I think as researchers at the university, a lot of us are applying to foundations, whether they're large or small, or federal grant programs that might have a related theme. So I think we're all looking for sources to apply and trying to do our best to get more funding.
And the philanthropic organizations, unsuccessfully we applied to the local foundation, but we'll keep on trying.
One thing I might mention is that with the grant funding process, a lot of these funding sources are very specific to what they're looking for in terms of projects or research priorities. And so what we have received in terms of feedback is that this particular case study kind of embodies agricultural cropping system issues and industrial environmental waste issues and kind of blends between the two. And so sometimes when you're applying for one, focus on agricultural crop production, it tends to lean and fall into these gray areas. Well, it might be more of an environmental grant than a agricultural grant. And then vice versa, if you're submitting for an environmental grant, it does appear to be a little bit more focused on the agricultural byproduct. So it's a little bit hard to target the funding for larger products when it's kind of this gray area intersecting two of these major different sectors.
Yeah, and that really is a problem because this is such an unusual incident that there really is no funding program that comes to mind that really fits what happened and what we'd like to do about it.
So we got another question in the chat. What is the range of organic carbon partition coefficient for neonics compounds used for seed treatment, and how this compares with the standard herbicides such as atrazine used in Nebraska? Are they more likely to leach? That's probably a tricky one. Dan, you're probably the only one that could actually answer that one.
I was going to look up my table of KOW, and I don't have that handy, but I think compared to atrazine, they may be more mobile. And we know atrazine is pretty darn mobile. So the good thing is they use much less neonicotinoid insecticide per acre than they do atrazine herbicide. So they're applying less on the field, which is good in that it's not going to end up in places that we don't want it to in comparison to atrazine.
This is going back to the question that we had about funding. How much money do you need for research, student, and faculty stipend support, etc.? A good amount.
A good amount. I mean, $1 million would be nice, really, by the time you get through, particularly with the long-term, wanting to run a long-term medical registry. That's expensive, and it's gotta be set up computer-wise, and then it has to be monitored and maintained, and you have to have people that can get back to that can recruit people and then get back to them. at various points, and so that's an expensive operation.
Yeah,
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm done.
I was going to add to that.
I'm done.
I was going to agree with you. $1 million a year for 10 years was what our initial request looked like. And I want to thank, Liz, you did it. I should have done it too. I want to thank again all of the faculty and staff who have been part of this process at both universities. They have essentially been using, and thank the state and Creighton, I guess, that pays Creighton salaries, because all of this has been done because we think it's really important. It has not been done because we've got dedicated dollars to do this work. So it's all done because of the love of the state and the love of the people of the state to say that this is important work and we need to do it.
I'll add that we had not planned for this project either. It
Right.
just fell into our laps. So we had no manpower on hand to devote to this.
Most of the funding for our efforts are really in the manpower, the labor, getting people to help coordinate the efforts and get out in the field and trek through the the waterways and collect the insects and the plants needed. So that's where a lot of the funding will go towards, and the pesticide testing.
And I had a question that I think, Ellie, maybe you'd be best served to talk about. Can you talk a little bit about what that medical registry would look like? What types of things would they be looking for? What are the inputs into that?
Well, the way we've envisioned it and is that it would be a medical registry for anyone that was interested in signing up. We're hoping to get maybe a couple of thousand people from Saunders County. That would include people who live near the contamination and others that don't. We want to include people of any age. We hope that parents would sign up their children, particularly small children. And then we haven't written the questionnaire yet. That's something we plan to do this fall. But it would include, questions, general health questions appropriate for people of different ages. And then the way we set it up is that we would check back with people quarterly to say, has anything changed? And so if they, they could tell us that, yes, so and so has had his appendix removed. Or whatever, if something did happen, and also set it up with the ability for someone, if they wanted to tell us something, they could, even though it wasn't on a quarterly basis, they could input that information. It would be set up for people with computers. This would be hard to do without computers, but people then would be monitoring this information and looking for how the people's health changed, and I think also looking for health problems that seem to be possibly related to this kind of compounds. Actually, an appendicitis wouldn't be related to that, but that's just a trivial example. But to take an example, particularly infants or small children who had neurological problems, that would be a huge red flag. Or so that's basically how it was set up.
Thank you, Dr. Rogan. So with that, we're coming up at the top of the hour, so I'm going to probably close it out for today. I appreciate all of you being here and assisting with this. And there was one last comment. I'm just going to throw this out here so that it can be stated. And this is from Kenneth. Lots of folks would be glad to support an appropriation request to the legislature, so please enlist our help if this team is planning to do that. And so, yeah, just wanted to put that out there. So closing up, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our speakers for their participation in this very interesting discussion. I greatly appreciate that. You can continue to follow this study on the UNMC College of Public Health website as researchers gain results and insights into the impacts of the contamination that has occurred at the AltEn site. You'll see a poll on the right-hand side of your screen asking you to provide feedback on your experience. Your response helps us continue to get better and further improve these sessions. Also, be sure to check out the forum schedule for other upcoming live and on-demand sessions this month. I'd also encourage you to join the Water for Food workspace on Slack to continue this very important discussion. Yeah, you should see the link in the chat box momentarily. If you missed any part of this, the session will be archived soon in an on-demand section of this attendee website, and I encourage you to view some of the other on-demand sessions as well. It's been a pleasure today joining you and having all of the experience and expertise be a part of this discussion. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for everybody's work and commitment to this very important topic and very important issue.